faithfully sharing insights and exploring great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally Talking Books. Today I'm introducing you to the book Dangerous Pleasures. Side top Prostitution and Modernity in 20th Century Shanghai. A glamorous yet turbulent land where winds and clouds converge. In stormy 20th century Shanghai, warlords, politicians, merchants, foreigners, gangs, and all sorts came and went quickly. Yet the hidden prostitute groups persisted, rarely noticed. Dangerous Pleasures unveils this little-known aspect for us. The author, He Xiao, is a history professor at the University of California. He's long studied Chinese labor and women's history, studied at Tianjin's Nankai University, visited China personally, and produced insightful works on modern Chinese women's history. The Dangerous Pleasures we're discussing today is a prime example of that. In the book, He Xiao meticulously traces sources like entertainment guides, travelogues, memoirs, novels, city laws, court records, and tabloids to recreate Shanghai's prostitution history, mapping China's 20th century modernity. Next, I'll break it down into 4 parts. This book. First, let's chat about the makeup of Shanghai's prostitute groups. Second, step inside the high-class brothels back then to see how they worked. Then, from an outside view, observe what effects the prostitution industry had on society. Finally, see how authorities managed and reformed the prostitution trade across different historical eras. All right, let's start by examining the composition of Shanghai's prostitute groups in the 20th century. It is a scape. Back then, Shanghai prostitutes mostly came from poor rural families nearby, or from middle to upper class homes ruined by social chaos. However, within this group, working conditions, life situations, status, and reputations varied hugely among different prostitutes. The top-tier brothels were called shuyu because the women there often played instruments, sang, and excelled at storytelling, giving it the name. Shuyu prostitutes generally sold art, not sex, mainly hosting the local upper crust. During the Republican era, some articles claimed Shuyu had strict discipline. If a prostitute was caught in an improper act with a client, should be thrown out immediately. Other articles, though, said Shuyu prostitutes. Actually, they did sell sex too, but only as secret affairs after mutual attraction. Later, Shuyu declined gradually, and many male writers felt frustrated, mourning the loss of an indescribable joy once reserved for the learned and refined. Now, it's become a vulgar commercial transaction where anyone with money can buy sex.
Brothels just below Shuyu were called Changsan and Yaoer.
Changsan has no direct link to dominoes. It got its name because in old Shanghai customs, they charged $3 for drinks and 3 for overnight stays, like the domino piece, Changsan. Though prices changed over time, the name stuck. Like Shuyu women, Changsan courtesans sang and danced too, just with less flair. They often wore lavish gowns, mingling at banquets and gambling tables with elites. Sex wasn't guaranteed, but they frequently stayed overnight with clients at hotels, similar to Chunsan, were Yaoer prostitutes, named after domino pieces Yao and Air, for charging 1,000 coins for tea and 2,000 for urging drinks. Yaoer women sang less skillfully than Changsan, charged less for sex, and had lower status. The next tier down were Hanzhuang and Xianruzhuang brothels. If sex was secondary or hidden in Changsan brothels, Hanzhuang and Xianruzhuang, catering to wealthy merchants, dealt purely in illicit encounters with no social pretense. By the 1930s, critics noted Xianruzhuang's boom mirrored Shanghai's hotel industry, nearly overwhelming Changsan and Yaoer. This shift marked the decline of the cultured brothel era, Shuyu, Changsan, Yaoer, into outright sex for money trade. The lowest tier were called Yeji, or pheasants. They were Republican Shanghai's largest prostitute group, vastly outnumbering others, soliciting openly on streets. At night, they lined major roads in the international settlement and French concession, clashing with police, facing arrest, and living tragically. Prostitute ranks also closely tied to regional origins. High-class courtesans mainly came from Suzhou, Wuxi, Nanjing, and Hangzhou. They spoke the soft Wu dialect of Jiangnan. Lower-tier women came nationwide but mimicked the dialect to appear refined. Clients preferred hometown prostitutes. For instance, during 1920s warlord chaos, wealthy Cantonese migrants boosted Shanghai's Cantonese courtesans' status. Follow. Reportedly, high-class Cantonese courtesans only served fellow Cantonese, rarely interacting with other clients. The strict hierarchy within prostitute groups is illustrated by this anecdote. A famous painter created calendar girl portraits that sold well, but a journalist exposed that the models were lowest-tier Yeji prostitutes and the painter had affairs with them. This scandal made respectable women, and even Changsan Yaoer prostitutes, feel demeaned, refusing to model for his calendars. Sales plummeted, ruining the painter's reputation and income. Descriptions of high-class courtesans often praised their elegance, refinement, and artistic talents. They were generally seen as sources of sophisticated pleasure. Now let's explore how high-class brothels operated. These establishments were highly visible, with complex systems and strict rules involving madams, servants, prostitutes, and clients. Brothels were run by madams who first rented premises, furnished them, and decorated interiors. Next, they hired or purchased prostitutes and servants. They obtained operating licenses and networked with restaurants, hotels, and other businesses to attract clients. Finally, madams cultivated citywide connections to handle extortion from local thugs. Running a brothel required significant capital and social connections. Thus, brothel madams were typically worldly and experienced.
Many were former star courtesans, past their prime.
Before the 1950s, high-class brothels operated openly and legally. New brothels adopted elegant names like Fragrant Breeze or Drunk Blossom Retreat, advertising in newspapers. A madam's crucial task was recruiting and purchasing prostitutes. High-class brothels sourced women three ways. First, hiring famous courtesans to establish reputation quickly.
These demanded high fees and specific terms, typically working 4-month contracts where madams kept all earnings.
Contracts were reviewed for renewal afterward. The second source was indentured contracts. Madams signed poor women to brothels for years, keeping all income. The third source was outright sale. Madams bought women's complete ownership from traffickers or destitute parents. Many sold this way were children. Madams hired tutors to teach them chess, poetry, and singing. But once adolescence hit, these girls had to entertain clients. After their 14th birthday, madams auctioned their virginity to the highest bidder. Then they began regular client service. Hearing this, you might assume madams controlled everything. But the author reveals complex power dynamics. No clear master-servant hierarchy between madams, high-class prostitutes, and staff. A seemingly enslaved prostitute might be a shareholder receiving annual dividends. Staff ordered around daily could be founding shareholders. The front-facing madam might just be their appointed manager. A 1919 newspaper story described a powerful brothel maid. When no clients visited at night, she slept in the prostitute's bed, while the prostitute slept on the floor. Such harshness supposedly protected servants' investments. If a prostitute underperformed, their dividends suffered. If she eloped with a client, they lost everything. Now let's discuss the central figures, the prostitutes themselves. Serving elites, high-class courtesans used artistic names like Li Ping, Xing Hua, Yun Yu, or Lin Dai Yu. Famous Shanghai aliases wore lavish gowns and jewelry, but many struggled financially. How did they maintain this image?
The answer: renting.
To attract wealthy clients, many courtesans rented jewelry from rich men's concubines or daughters. Failure to land big spenders meant they couldn't pay rental fees. How did these courtesans work daily? Contrary to assumptions, sex was secondary. Their main role was accompanying men to dinners, drinks, and gambling tables. Men summoned courtesans, called calling the escort, zaytuba, tea houses, casinos, or theaters. Attending was escort duty, outtuba. There, courtesans balanced charm and discretion, enlivening gatherings without overshadowing hosts, making clients feel esteemed. After a few escort calls, clients became regulars. To get closer to a courtesan, clients visited her brothel for tea, smoking, snacks, and chat, called Da Cha Wei. Unlike escort calls, Da Cha Wei was free initially, but after several visits, clients were expected to host banquets or gambling sessions or face courtesans' mockery. Oh, gambling and drinking parties were brothels' main income, so madams especially welcomed heavy drinking gambling clients. High-class brothels rarely took immediate payment, preferring tabs settled later. Bills were collected during Dragon Boat, Mid-Autumn, and Spring festivals, with brothels sending small gifts as payment reminders. Respectable clients sent servants to pay bills. Early payment usually meant a client had quarreled with a courtesan, signaling permanent separation. Of course, some paid but still owed deadbeats in modern terms. Brothels published subtle missing person ads threatening to expose their names. Uncollectible debts often fell on courtesans, so they chose clients carefully. High-class courtesans typically rose around noon daily. They scheduled meetings based on client intimacy levels. Afternoons might involve brothel leisure, smoking, mapping, sewing, or meeting regulars for shopping in rented rooms. By evening, they dressed for escort duties at banquets, often lasting past midnight. Afterward, they might accompany favored clients dancing or joyriding, rarely sleeping before dawn. Beyond grooming and social skills, fame came through flower ranking contests, like modern celebrity charts. Zhang Wen's film Gone with the Bullets dramatizes such Shanghai pageants, mirroring real history. Tabloids and venues hosted these contests where regular clients nominated courtesans or they performed talents. Pre-Republic, they mimicked imperial exams, crowning flower champions, second place and third place winners. After the Republic's founding, titles modernized to flower president, prime minister, and governor. In 1917, Shanghai's New World Amusement Park hosted a massive Flower Nation election for all local prostitutes. The rules involved ticket-based voting. Titles like president, vice president, and prime minister were awarded by vote count. Wealthy clients reportedly bought tens of thousands of tickets for their favorite courtesans. Winners saw their values skyrocket. During elections, they competed on stage for attention and campaigned offstage for votes. Of course, fame was fleeting. Their careers relied on youth. So they actively planned their futures. The most common choice was becoming a rich client's concubine. Many famous courtesans accumulated debts from lavish spending and client defaults. A tabloid described them as resembling China, burdened by debt without sovereignty or freedom. Overwhelmed, some chose marriage to start anew, but many marriages failed due to mistreatment by first wives or boredom with domestic life. After failed marriages, many opened brothels, transitioning from prostitute to madam. All right, that covers high-class brothels' inner workings. But Shanghai's discourse on prostitution wasn't just this. Dangerous narratives also emerged, focusing on human trafficking and STDs. First, let's discuss human trafficking. It was frequently mentioned in mainstream newspapers, reform reports, expose novels, and police court records. Per accounts, traffickers acquired women through purchase, deception, or kidnapping to force them into prostitution. Traffickers included not just professionals but also hotel staff, waiters, barbers, and jewelers. After acquiring women, traffickers sold them to transporters, who moved victims to other cities to avoid detection. News often reported women being resold multiple times, moving cities with each sale. Transporters typically resold victims to local middlemen rather than dealing directly with employers. Ultimately, these middlemen sell victims to employers like brothels, massage parlors, dance halls, and bars, a tightly organized human trafficking chain that can make a living woman vanish suddenly, causing immense public insecurity. But after carefully examining materials, the author found that despite constant reports on trafficking, most prostitutes weren't forced into brothels by trafficking. They entered voluntarily, mainly driven by poverty. For example, a 1951 survey by the Shanghai People's Government of 501 prostitutes showed that only 9% entered the trade due to trafficking. So why do mainstream narratives often depict prostitutes as entering brothels through deception? The author argues there are two main reasons. First, related to the laws at the time. During the Republican era, prostitution was legal, but human trafficking was illegal. Under Republican law, if a woman insisted she was a decent woman sold into prostitution, she had the right to legal protection. So when disputes arose between prostitutes and madams, the women often portrayed themselves as trafficking victims to gain more leverage. Additionally, citizen complaints to police prominently featured accusations of trafficking or kidnapping. But in reality, what truly angered citizens was the noise from brothels and street arguments. Since brothels were legal, it was hard to complain, so people often shifted to accusing them of trafficking. Second, it relates to attitudes of some reformers toward prostitution. Broadly, there were two views on prostitution. One saw it as unavoidable, with most women driven by life pressures. Government regulation was sufficient. The other believed all prostitutes were forced into it and should be abolished entirely. To push for government bans, the latter often amplified public opinion by exaggerating trafficking severity. All right, having covered trafficking, let's look at another major social fear caused by prostitutes. Spreading STDs, mainly syphilis, gonorrhea, AIDS, etc. In the early 20th century, Shanghai prostitutes were seen as the deadliest vectors for STDs. A series of articles in Shenbao claimed that at least half of Shanghai had STDs, with 90% initially contracted from prostitutes. Initially, foreign medical staff in Shanghai viewed prostitutes as the primary STD vector, repeatedly issuing warnings.
They saw the STD epidemic as a personal threat, arguing concession authorities must tighten prostitution regulation.
Amid this pressure, Shanghai's international settlement established mandatory brothel health checks with complex procedures, and prostitutes registered with the municipal council for photo IDs, then underwent weekly STD clinic checks. Doctors stamped cards to permit work. Those failing checks needed treatment before returning. Concession authorities could shut down brothels if infected women refused treatment. Prostitutes initially resisted checks but complied when clients preferred certified women, even using cards as advertisements. But only elite courtesans got regular checks. The policy was never fully implemented. Beyond controlling vectors like prostitutes, STD treatments also drew attention. Shanghai had both Western and Chinese medicine. TCM used scorpion plasters and toad soup remedies. Western doctors injected chemicals like arsenic, bismuth, mercury, and penicillin. TCM and Western doctors clashed over treatments and the epidemic's origins. Foreign doctors claimed prostitution and syphilis had always existed in China. They blamed China for its epidemic, while Chinese doctors insisted Portuguese brought syphilis from India to Guangzhou in the 1500s, noting ports with foreign sailors had worst outbreaks. Oh. Many reformers linked the STD epidemic to China's national destiny. They argued prostitutes, though victims, became breaches in China's national defense. Men infected wives and children through prostitutes, damaging national health and endangering the nation. By the 1930s, women's magazines advised readers to demand STD-free certificates from spouses before marriage to protect children. Reformers believed STDs threatened the Chinese nation, with prostitutes as breeding grounds for this foreign menace, necessitating total prohibition. Tabloids actively debated prostitution and STD transmission. They claimed high-class courtesans were cleaner, while lower-tier prostitutes were dangerous, tirelessly educating readers on spotting risks. For example, when visiting a prostitute, squeeze her hand to check for redness or swelling, inspect elbows for infections, etc. They blamed infected clients' moral failings, claiming men avoiding prostitutes wouldn't contract STDs. Despite differing views, all agreed rapid prostitution growth created societal dangers requiring government intervention. Now, let's examine how different era governments managed prostitution. As mentioned, prostitution's boom fueled trafficking and STD fears. To address these, Shanghai authorities launched multiple crackdowns with mixed results across eras. We'll explore this phase by phase. First, in the 1920s, Shanghai's municipal council initiated its first anti-prostitution campaign. Shanghai was divided into the International Settlement, French Concession, and Chinese-administered areas. The council governed the international settlement. The council deemed registration or inspection more practical than abrupt bans, fearing brothel relocations outside concessions and unlicensed proliferation within. But radical reformers formed a moral welfare committee, lobbying the settlement's highest governing body, the ratepayers' meeting, to pass a 5-year brothel elimination resolution. The resolution required, first, licensing and numbering all legal brothels. Then, annually revoking licenses for 1/5 of brothels via random selection. This would eradicate brothels from the international settlement within 5 years. Once passed, the council had to enforce it. By April 1924, the last brothels closed as scheduled, a seeming victory for abolitionists. But in reality, some brothels moved to the French concession or Chinese-controlled areas bordering the international settlement to keep operating, while others went underground, using various disguises to run unlicensed businesses. And prostitution and related criminal activities not only didn't decrease at all, but even spread to wider areas. So later, people widely believed that the Moral Welfare Committee's anti-prostitution campaign in the international settlement failed to control STDs or eliminate prostitution. It was all for nothing. Then, about 20 years later, after the anti-Japanese war ended, Shanghai came fully under nationalist government control, sparking a new round of prostitution industry crackdowns. Initially, the Shanghai municipal government vowed to cleanse the filth left by years of foreign occupation and war chaos, and to ban prostitution. But in practice, they felt that, given Shanghai's economic situation, they couldn't immediately shut down all brothels. So they chose a compromise, strengthening regulation, roughly following 3 principles. First, transform private to public, requiring all brothels and prostitutes to get licenses for regular government oversight, with rules like mandatory health checks and condom use for clients. End quote. Pattern bra, child. Second, simplify complexity, cracking down on new-style prostitution venues like dance halls, massage parlors, and guide services, demanding prostitution only happen in brothels. And this form was for easier management. Lastly, gather scattered into whole, setting up specific red light districts to strictly limit brothel zones, aiming to end the chaos of citywide brothels and street soliciting. It sounded thorough and perfect, but these measures quickly got stuck in mud due to bureaucracy and financial troubles. For example, the prostitute registration system was supposed to have all registered by 1946, but delays piled up. And by May 1949, when Shanghai was liberated, it still wasn't done. So, overall, in power, after Shanghai's liberation, the Communist Party-led Shanghai People's Government felt obligated to free the oppressed prostitute group and help them return to family life. But in the next 2 years, the Shanghai municipal government didn't rush to ban prostitution. Instead, it still required prostitutes and brothels to operate with licenses after registration, but introduced new rules like banning brothels from serving government employees, prohibiting drug sales, gambling, large banquets, and forcing prostitutes into service. I. Unlike the superficial efforts during the nationalist era, these strict control measures were effectively enforced. So, in early post-liberation Shanghai, while brothels were permitted, many shut down rapidly and prostitutes steadily decreased. So, why didn't Shanghai ban prostitution immediately after liberation? According to Xiao Manji, then director of Shanghai's Civil Affairs Bureau, the city government wanted to free oppressed prostitutes quickly, but initially lacked sufficient resources and personnel. They worried that rashly banning brothels might leave prostitutes homeless and unable to survive, so authorities temporarily allowed operations until fully prepared to overhaul the entire industry. But over 2 years after Shanghai's liberation, that day finally arrived. On November 13th, 1951, Shanghai's Public Security Bureau summoned all city brothel owners, ordering immediate closures and requiring them to arrange living situations for employees. 10 days later, the Shanghai municipal government formally announced the ban on all brothels. Police began citywide arrests of illegally operating brothel owners, sending prostitutes to labor camps for rehabilitation. In Shanghai, this anti-prostitution campaign started in 1951 and continued with gradually decreasing intensity. It lasted until 1958, when the government declared prostitution completely eradicated. Actually, the real challenge wasn't closing brothels, but reforming prostitutes to live self-reliant new lives. How did those labor camps achieve this? Simply put, a three-step approach. First, cure their STDs and other diseases free at all costs to gain trust. Second, provide ideological education, helping them realize their prostitution resulted from oppression in the old society. Now liberated, they must become self-reliant and build new lives. Third, organize productive labor, like making socks and towels, teaching essential skills, and fostering work ethics. During rehabilitation, prostitutes couldn't leave freely but had regular family visits. Well-behaved ones got home leave. Rehabilitation typically lasted 6 months. After passing paths included returning to verified families, factory assignments in Shanghai for well-performing women. That those without homes, agreeing after rehabilitation, were sent to state farms in Gansu, Ningxia, Xinjiang, etc., where they were helped to start families. Surprisingly, data analysis showed many prostitutes voluntarily chose this profession, finding it easier and more lucrative than other jobs. After reform and opening up, prostitution resurfaced in society. With brothels illegal, new sex workers secretly solicited clients in bars, KTVs, restaurants, cafes, and hair salons. To evade police, new forms emerged: long-term hotel arrangements, outcall services. Concurrently, STDs resurged, with cities plastered in ads for integrated TCM Western STD treatments. In 1993, China's Ministry of Public Security cited expert estimates of over 3 million sexually transmitted disease cases nationwide. Governments launched anti-vice campaigns against this new prostitution wave, but results were limited. Authorities hope to rehabilitate arrested sex workers through labor education, like the 1950s, but with little success. In the post-reform market economy, many reverted to prostitution after labor camps. Scholars extensively debated permanent solutions. They argued modern sex workers sought wealth, but lacked skills or morals, thus choosing prostitution to escape poverty. Eradicating prostitution requires continuously improving economic development and education levels. All right, that's it for now. Our introduction to 20th century Shanghai's prostitute groups concludes here. Well, Dangerous Pleasures not only details Shanghai's prostitution history, but reveals China's 20th century modernity journey. And, for example, studying STDs and prostitution shows rising public health awareness. Comparing anti-prostitution campaigns across eras demonstrates improved government social governance. It also explores broader themes: nation building, ethnicity, survival struggles, ideological conflicts, and urbanization costs. Author He Xiao calls his historical method peeling an onion. What this means is that historical inquiry is often like peeling an onion. Scholars meticulously peel back layer after layer, searching for an imagined essential core. They might end up finding nothing at all, but if you carefully study the onion's shape, texture, layered structure, and scent under different conditions, you'll uncover far more nuanced historical truths. All right, that concludes our discussion of He Xiao's Dangerous Pleasures for you. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.